My husband was standing at the stove, humming softly as he stirred a pot of tomato sauce, when his phone lit up with a message that changed everything. And instead of confronting him, I picked it up, read the words, "I miss you," and replied for him, "Come over," because sometimes the quietest answers are the ones that echo the loudest. The kitchen smelled like garlic and basil, warm and familiar, the kind of scent that used to mean comfort after 42 years of marriage. But that morning, it felt like a stage set for something I hadn't agreed to perform in. Thomas didn't notice me behind him, didn't see the way my hand lingered just a second too long on his phone before I placed it back exactly where it had been, screen dark, secret sealed. I watched him from across the room, the man I had built a life with, the man who still wore the same silver watch I bought him in 1989, the man who now seemed like a stranger moving through my home with practiced ease. He turned slightly, smiled at me like nothing had changed, asked if I wanted more coffee, and I nodded, because for that moment, I needed him to believe I was still the woman who trusted him without question. The truth was, this wasn't the first time something had felt off, just the first time it had spoken so clearly, in two simple words that didn't belong to me. I poured my coffee slowly, listening to the quiet ticking of the wall clock, each second stretching longer than it should, each breath measured and controlled, because I understood something in that moment that I hadn't fully allowed myself to admit before. Whatever was happening between him and that woman, it hadn't started today, and it wouldn't end with a confrontation. It would end on my terms. When his phone buzzed again on the counter, I didn't reach for it this time. I didn't need to, because I already knew she would come, and when she did, she would walk through my front door believing she was stepping into a secret, not realizing she was stepping into something I had already begun to rewrite. The rest of that morning unfolded with a strange kind of quiet, the kind that settles into the walls of a house when something has shifted but no one has acknowledged it yet, and I moved through my routines with deliberate care, rinsing dishes, folding the kitchen towel, wiping down the same clean counter twice just to keep my hands busy while my mind worked through every detail I had ignored for months. Because once you see the truth, it does not arrive alone, it brings everything with it. I remembered the late evenings when Thomas said he had extra paperwork, the way he started taking calls outside on the back porch even when the weather turned cold, the new shirts that appeared without explanation, pressed too carefully for someone who claimed he had no time, and I realized how neatly I had folded those moments away, telling myself that long marriages come with quiet seasons, that distance is something you endure, not question. I carried my coffee into the living room and sat in my usual chair by the window, the same place where I had spent years watching the neighborhood wake up, watching children leave for school, watching neighbors walk their dogs, all of it steady and predictable, unlike the feeling that had settled in my chest now. Something colder, something sharper, but not chaotic, not overwhelming, just clear. Thomas walked in a few minutes later, drying his hands on a dish towel, asking if I had plans for the afternoon, and I told him no, my voice even, my expression unchanged, because I needed him to believe that nothing had shifted, that I was still the woman who would not look too closely, and he nodded, almost relieved, as if my calm had given him permission to continue whatever story he had been telling himself. When he left the room, I allowed myself a single slow breath, then set my cup down and stood, walking to the hallway where we kept the small desk with our documents, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward with the quiet understanding that whatever came next had already begun. And as I opened the drawer and looked at the neatly stacked folders, I did not feel panic or grief, only a steady sense of direction. Because if someone was going to rewrite the life I had built, they would have to do it knowing I was already ahead of them. I did not start with confrontation, I started with observation, because truth has a way of revealing itself when you stop interrupting it. And that afternoon, I moved quietly through the house, noticing details I had overlooked before, the small things that only stand out when you are no longer trying to protect someone else's image. The guest room had been unusually tidy lately, the bed made with corners tucked in tighter than I ever bothered with, a faint scent of unfamiliar perfume lingering in the air that did not belong to me. And I stood there for a moment, not reacting, just absorbing, letting the pieces settle into place without forcing them. I opened the closet and saw an extra hanger pushed slightly to the side. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just enough to confirm that this space had been used differently than I had been told. and I closed the door again with the same calm I had carried all morning, because there was no benefit in rushing ahead of the truth when it was already unfolding at its own pace. By the time the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the living room floor, I had gathered more than enough to understand the shape of what I was dealing with. Not just a moment of weakness, not just a careless mistake, but something that had been growing quietly, carefully, right inside the life I thought I knew. Thomas returned from the store around 5, carrying a paper bag and offering the same easy smile, asking if I wanted to help prepare dinner, and I agreed, standing beside him at the counter as if nothing had changed, handing him ingredients, listening to the familiar rhythm of our routine, all while knowing that this version of normal no longer existed except on the surface. When his phone buzzed again, he glanced at it quickly, then turned it face down without a word, and that single motion told me more than anything else could have, because people only hide what they are afraid to lose control over. I did not ask who it was. I did not look at the screen, because I did not need confirmation anymore. I needed timing. And as I set the table that evening, placing each plate with steady hands, I understood that whatever was coming through that front door would not catch me unprepared, because I was no longer waiting for the truth to reveal itself. I was preparing for the moment it would walk in and meet me face to face. That night, after dinner plates had been cleared and the house settled into its usual quiet, I sat alone in the living room with only the soft glow of the lamp beside me, letting the silence stretch long enough for my thoughts to settle into something steady and precise. Because clarity does not come from reacting, it comes from allowing everything to line up without interference. I thought about the early years of our marriage, the small apartment with the cracked window that we could not afford to fix, the long evenings when Thomas would come home tired but still sit beside me on that worn couch, telling me about his day as if I were the center of his world, and I wondered when that version of us had quietly disappeared, not with a single moment, but with a series of choices so small they were easy to ignore until they formed something irreversible. I did not feel the urge to cry, not anymore, because what I was looking at was no longer just a betrayal of emotion. It was a pattern, something structured, something deliberate enough to require patience to dismantle. I stood and walked toward the bedroom, opening the closet slowly, running my fingers along the row of shirts he had arranged so carefully, noticing again the ones that were newer, more fitted, the kind he never used to care about, and I realized how much effort had gone into maintaining a version of himself that did not include me. On the nightstand, his phone rested where he had left it, charging, silent for now, but no longer neutral, no longer just an object, and I looked at it without reaching for it, because I had already taken the step that mattered earlier that day, and anything more would only rush what needed to unfold naturally. Instead, I turned away and opened my own drawer, pulling out a small notebook where I had started writing down details, dates, times, nothing emotional, just facts, because facts cannot be argued with. And if this situation was going to be resolved, it would not be through raised voices or dramatic scenes, it would be through preparation. As I closed the notebook and set it back in place, I felt something settle inside me, not relief, not even acceptance, but control, a quiet understanding that whatever was coming next had already been set into motion, and when the knock on my front door eventually came, it would not interrupt my life. It would reveal exactly who no longer belonged in it. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of ordinary beginning that makes it easier for people to believe nothing has changed, and I moved through it with the same measured calm, preparing breakfast, setting the table, pouring coffee into the same cups we had used for years, because routine is the easiest mask to wear when you want someone else to lower their guard. Thomas seemed lighter, almost distracted in a way that felt rehearsed, checking his phone more often, stepping into the hallway to answer messages he did not want me to hear, and each time he did, I simply continued what I was doing, never asking, never looking up too quickly, because silence invites confidence, and confidence leads to carelessness. By late morning, I could sense a shift in the air, something subtle but undeniable, like the quiet before a storm that does not announce itself with noise but with absence, and I knew without checking that the message I had sent the day before had been received exactly as intended. I spent the early afternoon making small adjustments, not dramatic changes, just details that would matter later, straightening the living room, placing an extra chair at the table, ensuring everything looked exactly as it always had, because the most effective stage is one that feels familiar to everyone except the person who controls it. Around 3 o'clock, Thomas mentioned he might step out for a short errand, his tone casual, almost too casual, and I nodded without hesitation, even offering a soft smile, because I understood that whatever plan he believed he was managing required him to feel unobserved. When the front door closed behind him, the house became still in a different way, no longer quiet with routine, but quiet with intention, and I walked slowly from room to room, not searching, not questioning, just confirming that everything was exactly where it needed to be. I checked the clock, listened to the steady ticking that had become my measure of control, and allowed myself a single moment to stand in the center of the living room, taking in the space I had built over decades, understanding that by the end of this day, it would no longer hold the same meaning for everyone who stepped into it. I did not feel rushed, I did not feel uncertain, because timing was no longer something I was waiting for. It was something I had already set in motion, and as the afternoon light shifted across the floor, I knew that when the door opened again, it would not be for a simple return home. It would be the moment everything hidden would finally step into the open. The house held its breath as the late afternoon settled in, the light outside turning softer, slower, stretching shadows across the floor in a way that made everything feel suspended between what had been and what was about to happen. And I sat quietly in my chair, hands folded in my lap, listening not for noise but for timing, because anticipation has its own rhythm if you allow yourself to feel it without rushing ahead. I thought about how many years I had spent adjusting myself to fit into the spaces of this home, making room for Thomas's routines, his preferences, his comfort, believing that was what partnership required. And now I could see clearly how easily that balance had been shifted without my consent, how something new had been built quietly alongside what I believed we still had. When the sound of tires on gravel finally reached me, it did not startle me. It confirmed what I already knew, and I stood slowly, smoothing the front of my blouse, not out of nervousness but out of habit, the kind of small gesture that keeps everything feeling normal even when it no longer is. The front door opened, first with the familiar sound of Thomas stepping inside, his voice carrying lightly as if nothing were different, and then a second set of footsteps followed, hesitant for just a moment before crossing the threshold fully, and I did not turn immediately. I allowed that moment to exist exactly as it was, unspoken and unmistakable. When I finally looked up, I saw her standing just behind him, composed but uncertain, her expression caught somewhere between expectation and realization, as if she had walked into a scene she thought she understood but was now beginning to question. Thomas's face changed the instant he saw me, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else might notice at first glance, but I saw it, the slight tightening around his eyes, the quick calculation behind his smile, and in that second I understood that whatever control he believed he had was already slipping. I did not raise my voice, I did not step forward. I simply met his gaze, and then hers, letting the silence settle around us like something deliberate, something chosen, because this was not a confrontation built on emotion, it was a moment built on clarity. I gestured calmly toward the living room, where everything was already in place, every detail exactly as it should be, and in that quiet motion, I made it clear that this was not an interruption of my life. It was the continuation of something I had already decided to see through to the end. They stepped into the living room exactly as I had arranged it, as if they were following directions they did not realize had been written for them, and I remained standing for a moment before taking my seat, not to make a point, but because I wanted them to feel the difference in position, the subtle shift that placed me firmly in control of what was about to unfold. Thomas cleared his throat, attempting a casual introduction that arrived too late to be believable, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty he could not quite hide, and the woman beside him offered a polite smile that did not reach her eyes, as though she were still deciding which version of this moment she had walked into. I let the silence stretch just long enough to remove any illusion of comfort. Then I spoke, not with accusation, not with anger, but with the same calm tone I had used all day, asking her if she had any trouble finding the house, because sometimes the simplest questions reveal more than any confrontation ever could. She hesitated just briefly, glancing at Thomas before answering, and that small pause told me everything I needed to know about how much she had been told, and more importantly, what she had not. Thomas attempted to move the conversation forward, suggesting we all sit down, suggesting we talk, as if this were a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with enough words. But I did not follow his lead. I remained exactly where I was, allowing him to feel the weight of a situation he could no longer control. I folded my hands in my lap and looked at him, really looked at him, not as my husband, not as the man I had built a life with, but as someone who had made a series of decisions that had brought us all into this room. And I realized in that moment that I no longer needed explanations. I needed closure on my own terms. The woman shifted slightly, her confidence beginning to fade as the shape of the situation became clearer, and I could see the realization forming behind her expression that she had not been invited into a secret. She had been brought into a truth that was no longer hidden. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush the moment, because this was not about catching them off guard. It was about allowing them to fully understand where they stood. And as I finally gestured toward the table, inviting them to sit, it was not an act of hospitality. It was an acknowledgement that the conversation they thought they were having was not the one that was about to begin. I let them sit before I did, allowing the quiet tension to settle fully into the room, the kind that presses gently against every word before it is spoken. And once they were seated across from me, I took my place with the same calm precision I had carried all day, resting my hands lightly on the table as if this were any ordinary conversation, because the power of the moment did not come from raising my voice. It came from removing any uncertainty about who understood what was happening. Thomas began to speak again, his tone softer now, measured, as though he were searching for the right version of events that might still make sense. But I lifted my hand slightly, not abruptly, just enough to pause him, because this was not a moment for explanations that arrived too late. I turned my attention to her instead, meeting her eyes directly, and asked her how long she had known him outside of work, not accusing, not emotional, simply factual, and she hesitated again, her fingers tightening slightly in her lap as she tried to find an answer that would not expose too much, but the truth was already written in her silence. Thomas shifted in his seat, discomfort settling into his posture, and I could see the realization spreading through him now that whatever story he had been telling had reached its limit, that there was no version of this that could be reshaped into something harmless. I allowed a small pause, letting the weight of that understanding settle between them, before I spoke again, my voice steady, explaining that I had seen enough, that I had known longer than they might think, and that what mattered now was not what had happened, but what would happen next. I reached beside me and placed a folder on the table, not dramatically, just deliberately, sliding it forward so it rested within their view. And for the first time, both of them looked at something other than each other, their attention drawn to the quiet evidence of preparation rather than confrontation. I did not rush to explain what was inside, because anticipation does more than words ever can. And as Thomas looked back at me, searching for something familiar in my expression, I offered him nothing but clarity, the kind that leaves no room for misunderstanding. Because this was no longer about discovering the truth, it was about revealing that I had already accepted it, and more importantly, that I had already acted on it. Thomas did not open the folder right away. He only stared at it as if it might explain itself without him having to touch it, while the woman beside him shifted again, her earlier composure fading into something quieter, more uncertain. And I let that hesitation linger because it mattered that they understood this moment was not rushed, not emotional, but deliberate. When he finally reached forward and opened it, his movements were slower than usual, careful in a way that suggested he already sensed what he might find, and I watched his expression rather than the pages, because reactions reveal far more than documents ever could. The silence deepened as his eyes moved across the contents, line by line, and I could see the exact moment understanding replaced denial, the subtle change in his posture, the way his shoulders tightened just slightly as the reality of what he was reading settled in. The woman leaned closer, trying to see, but he did not immediately offer the pages to her, as if holding on to them might somehow delay what was happening. But eventually she glanced over, her brow furrowing as she tried to make sense of something she had not been prepared to face. I spoke then, not to interrupt, but to clarify, explaining in the same steady tone that I had already met with a lawyer, that I had reviewed everything carefully, and that the decisions reflected in those pages were not made in haste, They were made with full understanding of what had been happening behind my back. Thomas looked up at me, searching for something in my expression that might suggest hesitation, regret, or even anger, but I gave him none of that, because this was not about emotion anymore. It was about resolution. I explained that the house, the accounts, the investments we had built together over decades had already been reorganized, that protections were in place, and that nothing he assumed would remain unchanged had actually been left untouched. And as I spoke, I saw the realization settle more heavily on both of them, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, unavoidable truth. The woman sat back slightly, her earlier confidence now replaced by quiet distance, as if she were beginning to understand that whatever she thought she had stepped into was far more complicated than she had imagined. I closed the folder gently once Thomas had finished reading, not to end the conversation, but to signal that the part they had expected to control was already over, and as I rested my hands calmly on the table once more, I met their eyes without hesitation, because there was nothing left for me to question and nothing left for them to hide behind. Thomas tried to speak, but the words did not come out the way he intended. They came out slower, uneven, as if each one had to pass through the weight of what he had just read, and I watched him carefully, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with the same quiet attention I had given everything else that day, because this was the moment where people reveal who they really are when there is nothing left to protect. He asked me when I had done all of this, his voice lower now, stripped of the confidence he carried earlier, and I answered simply, telling him that it had not happened overnight, that it had taken time, patience, and the willingness to see things clearly instead of pretending they were still what they used to be. The woman beside him remained silent, her hands folded tightly together, her eyes moving between us, as if she were trying to understand where she fit into something that had clearly been decided long before she arrived. And in that silence, her presence shifted from certainty to something far less defined. I explained that every account had been reviewed, every document updated, every decision made with the understanding that trust, once broken, does not rebuild itself through conversation. It rebuilds through boundaries, and those boundaries were already in place. Thomas shook his head slightly, not in denial, but in disbelief, as if he had expected a confrontation he could respond to, something emotional he could navigate, and instead found himself facing something final, something structured in a way that left no space for negotiation. I did not raise my voice, I did not repeat myself, because repetition is only necessary when someone is still unsure, and I was not. I told him that what happened next would be simple, that we would separate our lives in a way that reflected the reality we were already living, and that there would be no need for arguments, no need for scenes, only actions that matched the truth. The room grew quieter with each word, not tense in the way arguments feel, but settled, like something that had reached its natural conclusion. And as I looked at both of them, I realized that neither of them had expected this kind of ending, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was calm, controlled, and already complete before they even understood it had begun. Thomas remained seated for a long moment after I finished speaking, his hands resting on the table as if they no longer knew what to do, and I could see the weight of everything settling into him, not all at once, but in layers, each realization replacing the last until there was nothing left to hold on to. The woman beside him shifted again, this time not out of uncertainty, but out of quiet discomfort, as if she had begun to understand that whatever role she thought she was stepping into had no place in what was unfolding here. And for the first time, she looked at the room not as a visitor, but as someone who did not belong. Thomas finally stood, slower than usual, his movements lacking the confidence that had once defined him, and he glanced around the space as if seeing it clearly for the first time. The furniture, the photographs, the life we had built together, all of it unchanged on the surface, yet no longer his in the way he had assumed. He opened his mouth as if to say something more, something that might repair even a small part of what had been broken, but nothing came out, and I did not fill the silence for him, because some moments are meant to remain exactly as they are, unfinished, unresolved, but understood. I stood as well, not to match his movement, but because the conversation had reached its natural end, and there was nothing more to explain, nothing more to clarify, only the quiet transition from what had been to what would be. The woman rose shortly after, her posture more reserved now, her earlier certainty replaced by a careful distance, and she avoided looking directly at me as she moved toward the door, as if acknowledging, without words, that this was never her space to enter in the first place. Thomas lingered a moment longer, his gaze returning to me with something softer, something that might have once been regret, but I met it with the same steady calm I had held all day, because regret does not change outcomes. It only arrives after decisions have already been made. When he finally turned and followed her out, the sound of the door closing behind them was not loud, not dramatic, just final in a way that did not need emphasis, and I remained where I was for a moment, taking in the quiet that followed, a different kind of quiet now, not empty, but settled, as if the house itself had shifted back into alignment with something honest. I did not rush to move. I did not reach for anything to fill the space, because for the first time in a long while, there was nothing left to anticipate, nothing left to uncover, only the steady presence of a life that, while changed, was once again entirely my own. The house remained quiet long after the door had closed, the kind of quiet that does not feel empty but complete, as if something unfinished had finally been set down and no longer needed to be carried. And I stood there for a moment, letting that feeling settle fully into me before I moved again, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to recognize the difference between the life I had been living and the one that now stood clearly in front of me. I walked slowly through each room, not searching for anything, just observing. The same walls, the same furniture, the same photographs that had once represented a shared story, and I realized that nothing around me had truly changed except the meaning I had attached to it. And that realization felt lighter than I expected, not heavy, not painful, just honest. In the kitchen, the faint scent of garlic and basil still lingered from the day before, a quiet reminder of how ordinary everything had seemed before the truth had stepped into the open, and I paused there briefly, resting my hand on the counter, understanding that moments like that do not disappear. They simply take on new context once you see them clearly. I picked up the phone that had started it all, holding it for a second before setting it back down exactly where it belonged, no longer an object of suspicion, no longer something that held power over me, just a device, just a thing, because the meaning had already been removed from it. Outside, the evening lights softened the edges of everything, casting a calm, steady glow through the windows, and I moved toward the front door, not to leave, but to close it fully, ensuring it was secure, not as a reaction, but as a quiet final step, something simple that marked the end of what had been allowed to enter without question. I did not feel the need to call anyone, to explain, to justify, because some endings do not require an audience. They require understanding, and I had already reached that point long before this day had unfolded. As I turned off the lights one by one and made my way upstairs, I felt something steady settle within me, not relief, not triumph, but a quiet certainty that I had not lost anything that was truly mine, only what had already chosen to leave. And as I closed the bedroom door behind me, I understood that what they believed was a secret had never belonged to them. It had been the beginning of something I had quietly taken back, one decision at a time.